In the early 1930s, a boat carrying 107 mostly British communists arrived in St. Petersburg. These were starry-eyed immigrants determined to unite with the said-to-be glorious Soviet Union. They were expecting to arrive in some kind of promised land. With one accord, they had believed the false, though glowing reports, the fake news, that a utopia was about to be realized. It was, so they thought, the dawning of a new age. Heaven on earth was being created by the reputed to be fatherly Joseph Stalin. Well equipped for the adventure, the 107 arrived with mountains of trunks, bicycles, and gramophones. Well, these 107 fuzzy heads, I'm going to call them fuzzy heads, had no sense of the tragic comedy in which they had landed themselves. For in a matter of days, they had been swindled out of their money and stripped of their possessions and had to be looked after by sympathetic Westerners. And yet these sorts of dreamers were not alone. So many others too were led by the likes of the Irish-British playwright George Bernard Shaw, who was blinded by Soviet propaganda and their allies, the vast majority of Western reporters. And yet, as many have noted, the brute facts about the Soviet Union were always available, but many people found many reasons to deceive themselves and others about its true nature. Among the fuzzy heads back in Great Britain was an Anglican priest whose name was Hewlett Johnson. He became the dean, not the archbishop, but the dean of Canterbury in 1931. For 33 years thereafter, this priest, who came to be called the Red Dean of Canterbury, devoted himself to arguing that Soviet communism was some kind of heaven on earth. Cheerleading for Stalin, he exclaimed, "While we're waiting for God, Russia is doing it." That is, while Stalin was engaged in mass murder, the Dean wrote in the Socialist Sixth of the World that nothing strikes the visitor to the Soviet Union more forcibly than the complete absence of fear. About this persistent blindness, it was said that no communist outrage could put Johnson off his stride. Indeed, Johnson praised the Soviets for their toleration of religion, and upon meeting Stalin, reported excitedly that the great man favored freedom of conscience. So for all of his efforts in 1951, Johnson was awarded the Stalin Peace Prize, and then he received the Order of the Red Banner of Labor. But it wasn't just Stalin before whom the priest swooned. When he met Chairman Mao Zedong, the Chinese dictator, he again felt enraptured, describing the great man as having a countenance that was all lit up with warmth and radiance. Why, Mao had even said goodbye to him, the Red Dean reported, lingering in the courtyard to point out a lovely flowering tree. Now, the Red Dean was a great friend to Joseph Stalin and a great friend to Mao Zedong, but deplorably an enemy of Viktor Kravchenko, the author of the book I Chose Freedom, 1949. And if ever a voice should have been heeded in exposing the Soviet Union for the great evil that it was Kravchenko's, who had every credential to make him believable. For Kravchenko was not only from the Soviet Union, but from a working class background. He'd become educated there as an engineer, had become a party activist, and had held a prominent position as an industrial administrator. But in response to his book about freedom from Soviet tyranny, there was a huge backlash from the Soviets and their Western supporters. And eventually, Kravchenko launched a lawsuit against a French publication that had claimed that his book was full of lies, that it was some sort of collaborative effort with the United States. While the trial lasted for 2 months, receiving lots of publicity, well-known writers attended, including Albert Camus, Arthur Koestler, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Simone de Beauvoir. On Kravchenko's side were refugees like himself and former prisoners of the Soviet concentration camps. Against him were, of course, the Soviets and Hewlett Johnson, the Red Dean of Canterbury. Well, these together testified to the wonders of the Soviet system and discredited and denounced Kravchenko. Well, on display was a clash between truth-tellers and liars. Concerning the liars, I just mentioned that Arthur Kessler had been in attendance at the trial? Well, Arthur Kessler, well known for his book called Darkness at Noon, he wrote about, and this is what interests me and what I want to get across, is how is it that you account for the operations of the deluded mind, the kind of deluded mind that was put on display by the Red Dean of Canterbury. Well, the deluded mind, he says, engages in, I quote, elaborate maneuverings to defend its own citadel of faith against the hostile incursions of doubt, as he himself had once done, fully immersed, he says, in a blinkered, sectarian outlook on the world. But then upon traveling widely in the Soviet Union, 1932 and 1933, he saw the effects for himself of the Great Famine caused by Stalin's forced collectivization of the land. He says, I saw entire villages deserted, railway stations blocked by crowds of begging families, and the starving infants with stick-like arms, puffed up bellies, and cadaverous heads. Kessler then says that he began to struggle against what he called an inner censor that had kept him and many others from the truth, like something was blocking their powers of perception. That inner censor, what was it? It was an ideological shutter over the soul, that smothered the soul's innate ability to perceive what is true. Such an inner censor is so powerful, says Kessler, that it serves to be more reliable and effective than any official censorship. He describes that inner censor as an automatic sorting machine that suppresses truth in favor of lies. Everybody he knew was gripped by the inner censor, and all, therefore, he says, were experts. They had become experts at self-deception. No external Iron Curtain was needed for these, whose own private Iron Curtains did the job of protecting their illusions against the intrusions of reality. So, how are you going to break out of this? What can you do? The only escape, says Kessler, from the gripping power of that inner censor is finally to allow yourself to struggle, and he means struggle, to struggle with the gap between your beliefs and reality. You got to struggle with the gap between your beliefs and what's actually going on, to the point of being inwardly torn apart by the cognitive dissonance. He was saying that an enormous inner struggle is required to awaken the seeker after truth to a completely different frame of mind, a truly liberated mind that grants to itself, among other things, these key points. You've got to grant to yourself the possibility of doubting. That's number one. Number two, you've got to grant to yourself the possibility of making a mistake. Thirdly, you've got to grant to yourself the possibility of searching and experimenting. And number four is you've got to grant to yourself the possibility of saying no to any authority, literary, artistic, philosophic, religious, social, and even political. So Kessler's saying that to break the power of that inner censor, that you've got to tackle it head on by developing and applying a skeptical, critical spirit. When finally that inner censor is put out of commission, you have in its place what Kessler calls a counter-revolutionary mind. Now, interestingly, the American philosopher Daniel N. Robinson has said much the same thing when he writes about the necessity to maintain a critical spirit, a skeptical spirit, for all of your days. Says Robinson, you must be able to say that no matter how much this means to me, like whatever that is, no matter how much this means to me, no matter how centered my being is on this pattern of beliefs, no matter how close I am personally and emotionally and even romantically to those who hold such convictions, I must reserve the right to question and to doubt. No position, therefore, says Robinson, especially your own, is beyond criticism. In fact, you must always be prepared fully to launch a skeptical spotlight upon even your most cherished beliefs, opinions, and values. Says Robinson, I will retain this skeptical bias as an obligation owed to my own rationality, my own integrity. If, he warns, you lose that reason and suspend that criticality, become gullible, and accept anything that custom serves up, you enter the life of a puppet on a string, the life of a slave. So the alternative to this crucial, critical spirit is to risk becoming the sort of fuzzy head who gullibly swallows the latest lies and deceptions of our own day and time.